Today I'm going to talk about one of the new features in Server 2012. So just by a show of hands, how many of you guys actually have 2012 in your environment, in your workplace? Great. So some small adoption. So and if you guys, it's been a while since I've been and done one of these presentations. I don't know if you've had some presentations from Microsoft on a lot of the new features, but you know, there's quite a bit with Server 2012, and now with the release of 2012 R2 coming in October, you know, it's there's a lot to take over and to take on. So quite a learning curve. I think it's a big jump from 2012, kind of equivalent to going from NT4 to Windows 2000. So dynamic access control, that is a technology around security, authorization, authentication component piece. It's built to really be a game changer in the way people think about security. Let's see here. Thought I'd be able to just click my mouse. So dynamic access control in a nutshell, you know exactly what it is. It's trying to solve a number of issues that a lot of companies are facing. They're facing, I don't know if any of you have run into issues with token bloat. There's a big problem with years and years and years of NT administration going along and saying, okay, well, we've got a new resource that we want. We got a new file share. We got a new something. Let's put it through the IT department. Let's create 5 different groups associated with that. And then 10 years down the road, you know, everybody's looking at these groups wondering, you know, what in the world they do, who's in them, what are they, you know, granting and restricting. So there's a lot of management involved with keeping up with that. Data classification in that first column. Compliancy with government regulations, things like that, you know, with the WikiLeaks and all of these issues in managing your data. Just the sheer size of data that's coming out there, you know, these giant data farms that are stored. How do you organize and filter through this stuff? You know, things get organized in file directories and kind of get forgotten. And so there's not only with data classifications, but what we'll see in some demos with File System Resource Manager, which is a role in Server 2012. It can do a lot of work for you, workload and management of that data. Claims-based access conditions. We kind of touched on the issue of security groups and how to manage those and things like that. Well, with claims-based access conditions, it gives us a more flexible way of ACLing resources. Where before we were limited to just a security group, you had to create a security group, and you're either denied or permitted particular access control with that. Now you can do these very elaborate expression-based conditioning to, and we'll show some examples of this. I don't know if anyone's seen any demos, but it goes through and you can take what used to take 5,000 security groups to accomplish a certain thing and just get it down to just a random few. Expression-based auditing, that is similar to the claims-based access conditions, but you know there's a with security and internet and capabilities for everybody that needs to get to your data that can get to it. There is an auditing trail that needs to be in place, and I don't know in the past, you know, there were problems with, you know, how to parse through all this data. You set some of these features on, all of a sudden you got a security log that's, you know, gigs and gigs in size. How do you get through all that? And with your expression-based auditing, you can put together some, you know, pretty elaborate reports and conditions to monitor exactly not only the files and the data that you want to track, or only the people, you know, who are these people that you actually want to, you know, monitor whether or not they're looking at it or not. We'll show some examples of this. It will make a lot more sense. Encryption, you know, it's just one of, it's a huge want in dynamic access control, and one of the big differences between in 2008 R2, we released something called the file classification infrastructure, and FSRM, which we'll talk about here shortly. But one of the big requests was, okay, we want to act on data, on certain types of data that we deem to be confidential. One of those things that we want to do is to be able to just dynamically encrypt that stuff. Okay, it gets tagged. Let's go ahead and encrypt it. So that's incorporated in the product as well. So the building blocks, how all this stuff works. So right now we've just kind of talked a little bit about why we would use some of this stuff. But there's a couple of real-based reasons or functionality that's put into the product that makes all this stuff work. One of which is user and device claims. And we'll go into each one of these topics in a little more detail. But in a quick sentence, using claims rather than security groups, let's say you got your environment and you've got the finance department, you've got the legal department, you got the human resources department. Those are typically an attribute on your user object. You go in and look at the user, and there is an attribute called department. You throw that stuff in there. And then you turn around and say, okay, well, we have this directory or this file server or some application that the finance department needs access to do. Well, what do? You create a security group. You call the security group finance users. Well, what's the point in that when there's already an attribute on the user account? It says finance. You control that as users are classified and move in or out of particular roles. You change that attribute. That attribute change goes along with the claims and is going to be modified as you change security. So conditional expressions, we'll talk about that and show some examples of that. But basically, it's a very elaborate programmatic way of controlling security access rather than your basic, okay, you can read, write, full control. What's the security group? You can either allow or deny that. Now, as you'll see, you can get very, very elaborate with that kind of stuff. Classification enhancements. Classifications are basically just tagging data, tagging files, saying, okay, this is this type of file. But now we've got a lot of features in there to automate that process, to look for conditional strings to say, okay, I found something that looks like a credit card. I better go ahead and mark this as personal information and encrypt it if needed. So central access policy and audit policies. The feature of this is really when you look at all of your file servers out in your environment, who's to say from a compliance perspective, some auditor comes in and says, okay, I'm going to take a look at every single one of these file servers. Are they compliant with all of the security needs of your environment? Well, it's hard to say. You go in and you can look at the administrator of that particular file server, that team's file server, and try to find out, how security is administered. But with central access and audit policies, you can do it from a forest-wide perspective, from a global administrative perspective, and push down those policies on your file servers to make sure that you're compliant and do reporting based off of that being pushed out. So the first component here we're going to look at is claims. So identity really is, it's not a new concept to Windows. There's a user and what represents that user. In this case, just out of show of hands, who out there knows what a security token is? Security token. So basically in NT all the way up to now, how we do access control is a process wants access to a resource. That process contains many different components, one of which is an access token. And that access token is just a representation of who you are. So when you go through an authentication process, you're proving your identity to a domain controller or a trusted authority, and in turn, it's providing a representation of you, the security groups that you're in, all bundled together into this security token. Now, when we want to make authorization decisions against resources, what we do is we talk to that resource. We present the security token, which is a representation of not only you, but the security groups that you're in. And based off of that, the resource can make authorization decisions through its access control list to say, okay, well, you are a member of this, so therefore you are granted or denied permissions. So that's your underlying concept. So how do we add to that? Claims are basically like your security groups. In here, it's information a trusted source makes available about an entity. So in this example is somebody's passport. You know, when you or your customs agent is handed a passport, they didn't make that passport. They look to make sure that it's valid and issued by the United States of America, and therefore it's going to trust whatever this thing says. And in here, you're going to see that there are a number of claims about this particular user, and that passport agent is going to be able to trust beyond a shadow of a doubt because it trusts the issuer of that passport every single one of these parameters. So very similar to the same way things used to work with the trusted authority being your domain controller, or more specifically, your KDC, Key Distribution Center, Kerberos. Now you're just not limited to security groups. Now you're limited to whatever in the world this thing wants to say. It can say, this guy's shoe size is size 12. And now the application is going to trust, I've been handed something, this security token that not only includes security groups, but now it includes a claim. It's just a fact about the holder of the security token, and then it can make decisions based on that. So here's your basic format of what is a claim. A claim contains a unique identifier, resource identifier. This is your type, AD:/// department. That can be, anything you want, but it's got to be unique. And so you then have a value of what exactly that is. So in this case, this long string that's just formatted, and this is just the formatting of how it works. Department has a value of human resources. It also has a type, which is just going to restrict or indicate what type of data is in there. Is it string? Is it an integer? Is it true, a Boolean, true, false? Basically, those three things combined is how you're going to be able to identify and pass a claim to a claim consumer. So what are claim types? You've got user claims, device claims. This is pretty interesting. You can imagine out there nowadays, bring your own device is a huge thing. There is, you'd like to know, okay, well, I've got this secure data. Yeah, you have permissions, but are you at a kiosk? Are you on your phone? Or are you at your computer that's on the LAN? Well, one's going to be a lot more secure than the other. You can make conditional decisions of whether to grant or deny access to this data if based on what device the user is connecting with. A transformation claim, this one's can get a little complicated, and it'll make more sense when we actually do the demo, but when you're going from one security boundary or Kerberos realm to another, like a trust between two organizations, we saw before with what the requirements of a claim are, you had this type. Well, that type may be defined in company A, but it may look entirely different or behave entirely different in company B. So a transfer claim is just a way for the KDC to take an incoming claim from a partner organization and manipulate it and construct it to where it makes sense to them. Maybe they have, what's called department and what they call administrators in their company, they call them managers. So there's a real easy way to go through and say, here's a claim. The title is administrators, but we call them managers. So in that transformation, I will change their claim to no longer say administrators, now I'll say manager. And so we talked about claim types. So these are just the value of different types of data that can be stored, and one of these have to be defined. Boolean is just yes and no. You can either have a multi-valued string, a claim that can include one or more parameters, such as a user may be both in sales or marketing. That's probably not a good example, but it's just something identified that can contain multiple values. You got a security identifier, one that would be something similar to a security group, and then integer values, things like that. Pretty straightforward. And so, expression-based policy. This, I think I may have skipped a slide in here, or this one didn't get moved around very much. I may come back to this one. This is actually going into our policy definition and conditional expression. So a little later on in the presentation, I think this is copied. So user and device claims. Just a quick comparison here. Basically, pre-2012, you were restricted just to security groups. There was no way to do that transformation that we talked about. And there's no way to make things access control based on characteristics of user devices. There's one exception to that. There was something when NTFS was introduced where you could confirm whether or not it was a smart card authentication or not. I forgot the term, but now it's much more dynamic in the way they can handle these things. So the next piece of the puzzle, we talked about claims. So you can do this just with security groups if you want to, but just now know that you're not limited to that. File classification infrastructure. Why do we do that? It is information, it's an alternate data stream on the actual file data, but it includes information that's going to move with that file. So, with security, a lot of times, okay, I've got, a file, and it's going to inherit the security of the directory in which it resides. Well, with file classification, you can classify a file that is embedded in that information of the file. As it moves around, it's going to stay classified. That's just one. As well as, go on to the next slide, but file classification infrastructure. This actually was around in, that should be 2008 R2 instead of, okay, 08 R2. So 2008 R2, it was introduced in the File System Resource Manager, and we'll take a look at that. But there was a lot of limitations to it. It basically granted a way for you to manually set a classification type localized to that file server, and it's basically a list of categories in which you could go to your files and you could tag those individual files. There was no UI to do this, so you couldn't just right-click on a file and go to Properties and take a look at the stuff. You can now, as we'll show. You had to rely on the File System Resource Manager, which you would base rules on that and then have those rules run at a configured schedule. Now there's this thing called continuous classification, where when you create the file or you modify the file, let's say I take a file, open it up, I put a credit card number in there. It's going to immediately, upon updating that file, recognize that there is a credit card number in there, reclassify it, and act on that, such as encrypt. So things have moved a lot since 2008 R2. But it's good to know, there's just a very limited few out there that raised their hand when they said they've introduced Server 2012. A lot of these features you can kind of get started in 2008 R2. And actually with the schema updates to Server 2012, you can go ahead and leverage a lot of this stuff through PowerShell and actually get a lot of this benefit as long as you have Server 2012 file servers. So we talked about a UI. This is what it looks like now when you right-click on a file. You've got a classification tab. It's going to go through. This one says impact. This actually doesn't have any value currently, but if it did, you can see at the bottom you've got some choices there. It's either high impact data, moderate, or low. Personally identifiable information, is it PII? Here's a way that you can mark and know and do reports based off of those classifications. Your CIO wants a report to know who's been looking at health-related medical information. You can have searches based on looking at all documentation to say, what are medical records and who's looking at them. Let's say you're a government contractor that builds super secret satellites. You can create a search string based off of part numbers, a part of buzzwords that are around this, and have it classify data and build reports off of who's looking at any of these confidential documents. That's basically how it works. Resource property definitions, we talked about that on a global scale. We configure these parameters. We basically define what is the classification, impact, what are the potential possible values, high, moderate, low. There are also inbox content classifiers as well as third-party classification plugins. You'll see you can go through and kind of make your own classifications, such as, I want something that looks like number, dash, number. And you can build that with the inbox content classifications. You've got that. You've got an API to call into a PowerShell script if you'd like to have some script invoked as it runs one of these classifier jobs. But there's a lot of third-party stuff out there, and some very elaborate third-party stuff. I've seen things that will analyze bitmap graphics and determine what they are, and classifications, as well as a lot of your government regulation agencies. You've got your NIST and your SIPs compliances and all of the information that those regulatory agencies have deemed. You've got to be able to find this stuff in your environment if you're going to work with us, and you can't make it available. So this FCI is a technology built inside Server 2012 where it can make decisions and run rules against the data in order to then do work. So what can it do? One of these are security measures. We talked about the whole concept behind dynamic access controls. We're going to be able to make authorization decisions based off of this information. But there's a lot of other things that FSRM can do. These file management tasks, we talked about encrypting data. Okay, it gets a particular classification. This thing needs to be encrypted regardless. And this is information that's going to, can't be transferred from server to server. It's encrypted. It can do retention tasks. It can say, okay, well, these particular files don't need to be more than a year old. So as soon as they exceed 1 year, file server, go grab these and go throw them away, or go put them in an archived directory. So file classification, that's basically the other half of the equation here. And now we've got our conditional expressions, which kind of tie the two together. You can think of, okay, I've got claim, department equals finance. I got a classification on the file that says finance. You can create a conditional expression that says user must have this claim finance in order to look at any files that have the classification as finance. Now you don't have to worry about where the file is located. Did you put that finance file in the correct directory which restricts permissions? Now you can move that file all over the place. And as long as the server in which that file is located is covered administratively under where you place these policies, it's going to restrict or grant access to that user based on that. So expression-based ACEs. This just goes into a little bit of the detail. This is one example. You might have seen these if you guys have been looking around on the internet. There's plenty of people that have done these speeches. It's a major change with the introduction of Server 2012. And they do these examples of, okay, let's consider you've got 500 projects, you've got 100 different companies and 10 different divisions in your organization. Typically, how you'd have to do that would be, the engineering users for Project Z in the UK need a security group, and then so on and so forth. If you're in Canada, create a new security group. I've seen companies, I worked in CTS, where for about 9 years, where I took incoming calls from companies, worldwide, every day somebody different. And you wouldn't believe the number of companies out there that is, okay, here's our method of operation. It is when you create a directory or a file share, create two groups. Create the read-only group and create the write group. And it just let it build and build and build. So now with Server 2012, you can use and or expressions. So if this user is a member of Project Z and a member of this and a member of engineering, then now grant him access. By being able to use this anding, you've changed 610 groups from 500,000. And then with central access policies and classifications, now you not only have the user's token in which you can make these decisions based off of, but you can also make decisions based off of the resource properties. So you could say that the resource property is going to be Project Z. If it's a Project Z file, it's going to have a resource of Project Z. And so now your user is already got an attribute called country. Why not use that? Don't create a security group called country. Use the one that's built into Active Directory users and computers. Now you're not even using security groups. In this example, you've got 3 user claims and a couple of resource properties. And you're able to accommodate the same restrictive ability of 500,000 security groups in scenario A. So, conditional expression operators. I would recommend, rather than us going into some great detail, I got another slide with some examples here of how to write these things. But basically, you've got your and or not. Does something exist? Are some easy to use? Then you've got relational. Is this user a member of this or a member of any? And have a series of groups. And luckily, you've got a GUI in there that kind of helps put this stuff together. But you can also open up this expression sandbox to build these things on your own. There's a lot of help out on the internet for that. I think this might, or if that other slide is not exactly this, kind of the equivalent of where we're going with all this stuff. So basically, the central access policy is taking the conditional expressions that we talked about, and it's allowing for this global administration of this stuff. So all it really is I'm going to take permissions, just like you would with any directory, but you can say, I'm going to create this set of permissions, such as department people need look at department files. Finance can look at finance, so on, and human resources can look at human resources. Let's create this standard conditional expression, and let's push it out through these central access policies and push them to all of our file servers, so that you could kind of do this a little bit with group policy. There's definitely some enhancements now, but kind of the equivalent of your old group policy where you would go under File and you could set permissions, to a particular directory, but you had to know, what was the name of that directory? What was that path to that file in order for me to be able to set the permissions on that via group policy? Now you don't have to know the names. You just have to know things that I've classified in this manner. These people are going to get permissions to it. Now, an example, our demo will make this look a little bit easier, but, kind of similar to your NTFS permissions. This is your MCSE question here of how do you grant and deny permissions to particular file shares. Basically, you've got share permissions, which the difference being I'm localized on this particular box, or do I have to go off box and remotely connect to this resource? If I have to remotely connect to this resource, I have a gauntlet of permissions that I have to get through. The first one is share permissions. If my share permissions only grant me read access to this file, but I have NTFS permissions that grant me full control, well, the most restrictive ends up winning. So guess what? I only get read access. If I can walk my butt over to the console and type myself in and log on, now I'm no longer restricted to those share permissions. I'm exclusively just relying on NTFS, and now I've got full control. So it's that combination of share permissions to NTFS. Now we've got a third one here. There we go. Now we've got a central access policy added on top of that. So the big point here is that the central access policy does not overwrite or the previous other mechanisms used for security. It's a combination of all these things. So if you have a directory that grants or denies user accounts based on security groups, and then a global access policy comes along and does something different, it's going to be a combination of those things, and the most restrictive is going to be the ultimate outcome. So how it works, you've got basically the same thing I talked through. You've got your share permissions in your file, and then ultimately the access check is going to see, okay, does this particular access rule pertain to the file that this person's trying to ask? It looks at, okay, what's its classification and what claims are in there. Just see, 7, what time is this first one? 7:15, so I got about 15 more minutes. Is that right? Yes. Mm-hmm. No, well, we'll actually go through that here a little bit later. There is something called a compound ID that is a new feature in Kerberos with Server 2012, and that allows for the device to pass claims and put those claims inside that security token that we talked about earlier. So, just another example of central access rules, and basically what we've been talking about of some examples. If you're this and that, here's how you can ultimately calculate whether or not you have permissions or not. Wow, this thing is... Maybe it's my mouse. Oh, I'm sorry. They were sitting there populating. So we got a little animation here on this thing. But basically, it's going through the different rule set. I'm going to go ahead and skip over this unless anybody really wants to get on this. I think the more interesting part is going to be under the covers, exactly how it works. So I'm just going to get through all this. Here's a couple of examples of what what central access policies look like. You've got your expressions there, the equal sign. So this is in the format of either user.title or computer.DNS host name. It's basically object type, either user or computer or device, user or device or resource when we talk about classifications, dot whatever the either the claim name is or the classification name is. So in this it's saying user.title, so the user's title needs to be PM, and its division either needs to be finance or sales. So now you've got a combination of requirements in order to grant or deny permissions. The second example, user.project, any of resource.project. That is basically saying the user.project value, so let's say the project is satellites. And this is one of those, I was trying to think of an example of multi-valued strings. This is a great example. Let's say the guy is a member of satellites and missiles. So now he's got these two projects under his belt. The resource project is jet fighters. Well, the two user project claims that he has does not match what the resource project classification is. Therefore, they would not be granted permissions. But if resource was satellite, then one of the user's project claims would then match the classification of the file resource, and therefore you got to match, granted permission. The third one down at the bottom is just does it exist? Does the user have the department claim? If so, let them on in. And then staging. So this is a big thing because ultimately, and I know exactly what all you guys are thinking, there is some huge growing pains with this, and there's no way I'm about to go do this in my environment because there is an incredible amount of thought and work and issue that has to go and involved with this whole thing. So what they provided is the staging piece to where basically, and the demo will kind of show this a little better, but you go in and you can either set the classification, you can set the rule, or you can just say, I just want to see what it would look like if I did that. And it would not change any of the existing security. So this just talks about, okay, you can create it as a staging policy, and we'll see that in the demo. And the staging policy is going through, and this is just an example of whether or not it would have access. Oh, our current policy says if you have file impact of high and you are in Contoso, then full control, allow. But later on, you want to kind of tweak that a little bit, and you want to use this new classification called clearance. So now when before we didn't have to have clearance, now what would it look like if we had both of these? Now, you don't want everybody calling up the IT department saying, hey, I don't have access to my crap anymore. So now you can come along, preemptively set the permissions, set the conditions exactly the way you want it, and just sit back and look for the 4818 event, which says Alice came in and she tried to access this file, and I let her do it, but guess what? Come time of you changing this to this, she won't have access anymore. So just let it sit there for a month or two or more and make sure that your changes won't be impactful. All right, so how does all this work? Kerberos and the Kerberos token. So I don't know how familiar you are with how Kerberos works, but basically security involves, we talked about, a mutual authority or a trusted authority. In this case, it's the KDC service. So how you get access to things is, hey, I'm Joe User. I go talk to a domain controller who's running this KDC service. I say, give me a ticket granting ticket. And he says, well, who are you? I'm Joe User. Here's my password. He says, okay, that checks out. Here's your ticket granting ticket. Now I have this ticket granting ticket that I can then return to the KDC and say, okay, now I've got this ticket that represents me. Can I give that to you, and in turn you turn around and give me a service ticket to this file server over here? That, he says, sure, let me package this thing up. That thing that he packages includes pack information, which is used to build that security token that we talked about. That service ticket comes down, says, okay, now I can go give that service ticket over to the resource, and the resource can then build the security token based off of that ticket and then make authorization decisions off of that he built. So here's what has changed in order to let all this beautiful stuff work. Dynamic access control The key here is it leverages Kerberos. So NTLM will not do any of the stuff. You got to make sure your stuff is using Kerberos. Compound ID. So this answers the question of, how did we pass that device claim? The device equals what? Did it look at MAC address? No. What it does is it performs what's referred to as this compound ID, which is ultimately, and we got a little animation of how this actually works, but we go through and a computer has to go and get a Kerberos token the exact same way that a user does. And so what happens when you turn your machine on, it goes through that exact same transaction that we talked about for the user to get to the resource, except it's the computer loading up. The user comes along and says, hey, I want access to a resource, except this resource is going to be my local workstation. So he's got to go and get a ticket for that local workstation. That communication that he had to do before is pretty protected in that everything is encrypted and uses these hash algorithms to make sure that you can't break this stuff. But now we got this thing called fast optimization, where there's a slide on this, to where when we go and do that transaction, we actually do that tunneled through the security in which the computer has already established with the domain controller. So now as a user, I just kind of piggyback on that, and during the piggyback, the information's already there, so when you go and talk to a KDC and say, KDC, I want that service ticket, you can turn around and say, now when you're stuffing that pack with my security groups and my claims and stuff, why don't you go ahead and throw in all of the claims that are on this device? So that's compound ID. Domain controller group. So domain controllers have to have the capabilities to issue this stuff. So you got to have a Server 2012 domain controller. NT tokens. So your token actually has the user and device separated. You've got this token, and you've got areas in there for both user and device. All right, so how do we do it? First thing is, and we'll go through this in the demo, the AD domain admin comes along and creates these things. He chooses which attributes are important enough to set as claims. And so does anybody here, can they think of a security hole that would easily come into play if I all of a sudden said, I'm going to make authorization decisions based on the home state of the user. I only want people from North Carolina accessing North Carolina stuff. You better make sure that people can't willy-nilly go in and change the state in which they belong. If you set it on an attribute and you grant the user to go through and make human resource changes to attributes about itself, such as the state in which he lives, you better make sure you don't make authorization decisions based off that attribute. So, something to keep in mind when you're creating these things. Set permissions restrictively on these things, and there's also an option to say, don't delete. Make sure this is something that you can't delete. So, then we come along, and now we get our claim types. This is them defining that. User attempts to log on. It gets a Kerberos ticket. And the Kerberos ticket now includes both groups and claims. We then go to a file server, hand it the ticket, and it can make decisions based off of those claims. Mm-hmm. 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 No, well, there are a lot of changes to NTFS, but ultimately what this is doing, and I am trying to think of, there is an API call, something that was created back in Windows 2000 that triggers in auth-z to say, there is some additional check that needs to be validated in order to do this. It was something that was pre-built all the way back into Windows 2000. And during the break, I can look through and find that if you're interested. But there is an extension to NTFS. All of the claims, all of this information is all stored in Active Directory and pulled from Active Directory. And you need certain things in order to make these steps work, of which we use the supported encryption types attribute for Kerberos. So you're passing along to see, okay, what all of these people that are talking and trying to do this, are we all on the same page and we're all compatible with these features? We use supported e-types that we can use to query and verify that all of those things happen. But ultimately, yes, there is a piece within the Auth-Z technology that will evaluate the stuff based off of that. I don't think there is any kind of performance hit based off of this. In fact, you're probably just based off of we talked about token bloat and things like that. You know, you're going to potentially even see better performance.
Did they change the limitation of the maximum number because nesting and groups is what causes the token bloat? So did they change that limitation?
No, well, I'm just saying that with the advent of claims and all this stuff, what used to require a security token of 75, or you may have 100 plus security groups, now you have the capability to reduce that. Now, if you just add this to an existing infrastructure that's poorly designed, I don't want to say poorly designed, but if you don't clean up, then you don't get to see that benefit. But let's say, when we talk about performance, now you're all of a sudden you're in an environment where you're leveraging claims and you're leveraging classification. Now, this stuff is going to be able to transport with a much smaller security header. But there is a lot in 2012 advancements to that. So we're down to 3 minutes, so I'm just going to go through this stuff real quick. This was what I have already described about the flow of pre-Windows 2000 to where basically we're getting the TGS is the service ticket. We send it over. We don't have any claims in there. It's going to make decisions off that. Now we do the same thing with claims. Really the only difference is the TGS returns with claims. And we'll see that in the demo. Now you've got pre-Windows 8 clients. So how can we use this stuff if all of our workstations, we've got a mix of Windows 7 and Windows 8? Well, there is a feature within the file server called S4U2 Proxy, or I'm sorry, S4U2 Self, which is a API for Kerberos that allows the file server to basically take the incoming requester, impersonate that requester to go get a service ticket for itself. And that way, it being Server 2012 and it being aware of these features can go and say, oh, you came to talk to me without any claims? That's all right. Let me go and get your Kerberos ticket again for you, and I'll ask for the claims. And now we got the claims, and now we can do it. So you're not restricted the client. You are restricted the server. Server needs to be Server 2012. So this is just that example. Pre-Windows 8. Compound identity, we already talked about that. So this is basically the computer goes first, and when the computer goes back, the user TGT is piggybacking on the machine TGT, and it goes through and does all that stuff. Across force boundaries, we already talked about. I'm sorry, quick question?
Yeah, if I remote into a workstation, which computer is doing the
Okay, so if you RDP into a workstation, you are ultimately, in the initial request, you are building a security token to communicate with the remote desktop server. And so now that you have a session within that server, you are going to be I don't think it's going to take any of the claims from your original device in the session of the RDP server. So you could make decisions to the RDP server to say, this RDP server, they can't be doing it on their phone. They got to at least be doing it on a protected system. As soon as it gets to the session on the RDP server and it's got a remote session, then that token in there is not going to include the claims of the previous machine, but it will then include the claims of the machine in which it's RDP'd into. I'm 90% sure it's kind of one of those things where that would be my answer here on stage, but I would double check that. Forest boundaries. We talked about transformations, and we're at 15 minutes, and we're almost to the end of the slide. So ultimately, to the cloud, the big revelation here with dynamic access control and claims. Who out here does anything with NTFS or any kind of federation service? Great. So federation, that's the big wave of the future, how we all can get along out in the internet world on the cloud. And so, and ultimately what it does is it's the same thing that we talked about with the properties of the claim. It's a attribute value pair. As long as everybody agrees on the attribute value pair, then whatever's there is going to mean the same thing when it's in domain A or if it's in cloud B. Now, a trust partnership has to be in place, but ultimately what this goes to is, hey, I'm playing around in Contoso domain. All of a sudden, I change to a cloud app that is claims-based. I can turn around with that ticket granting service ticket that I would normally get, and I go talk to the cloud's going to be like, I have no idea what a Kerberos service ticket is. Go back. It will then be able to go directly to the NTFS server without the NTFS server having to communicate with the domain controller and say, NTFS server, you know this cloud app up here. He wants a SAML claim. Okay, well, I am able to take that claim information that's in your token and process that through the claims pipeline and return those claim values in the SAML token without having to go to a domain controller. I can transform that in the claims pipeline, do whatever you want, and then send that up here, and cloud gets to make decisions. And I think we are 2 minutes behind. And that's about it. So after this, does anybody have any questions? So what I've got is a demo that we can do after the break of just let's open up a Server 2012 simple domain environment and just look at setting up some of the stuff. I've got a very simple environment here. I didn't do anything too elaborate. We've got just a little bit of time. So it's just a domain controller, file server, workstation. So first thing we're going to talk about are the different components and where to actually store these components in Active Directory, or how to configure those. We go through a utility called Active Directory Administrative Center, or administration. Here, administration, administrative. Administrative Center. So one of the reasons that you have to get to know something other than Active Directory users and computers. So with this, we've got our Dynamic Access Control tab where we can go ahead and configure all these products. Now, if we were to look, let's see, adsiedit.msc. This stuff is stored in the configuration container, meaning that it's forest-wide. These settings are forest-wide. Go in here under Services, Claims Configuration. Basically, it's going to look very similar to the nodes that you have here. So, the first thing that we're going to look at are claim types. So we're going to go ahead and create a few here. New claim type. Now let's go ahead. We've been talking about department, so I'm going to go ahead and select this guy. So you can select what type of claim can this be issued to, either user or computer. You've got a description here. Now, we've got this. Oh, it looks much better on that screen. So we have this thing here called set ID to semantically identical claim type in a trusted forest. So what does that do? Actually, it'll be better after we create this thing to see this. But you remember in our claim properties, or what makes a claim, we've got a unique identifier, which is our claim URI. And so we can either automate the fact that, okay, I'm created in this forest, give me a unique something another. Or we can manually define it. It's just a way to manually define the claim. That way you got two forests that you know you're going to be in partnership with. You can make this unique identifier the exact same for forest A as you do as forest B, and a simplified way rather than have to worry about those transformation claims that we talked about. Protect from accidental deletion. Here's how you can make sure that you cannot delete that attribute. Or delete, the object that represents this claim type. Suggested values. Here we can go through and say, okay, we want to add a couple here. Let's say finance. And I'm not going to get too creative here for the sake of time. And management. And engineering. And then, okay. And so now this ID, this is the randomly generated unique identifier that it creates. If I had selected, and we'll do another one and select that. So let's say we'll create a claim type of company. And this time we will name it. We still want to use that same convention, AD colon extent company 1. And this time we'll just have no suggested values. So now when I create a partnership, if the administrator over in this other forest had created something called company, and you go through your forest trust the same way that in Kerberos, the way Kerberos works with security groups, is it says, I'm just going to package up all the security groups of the user forest, and then when I go and talk to a KDC in the resource forest, I come with what's called an inter-realm ticket, and that ticket includes pack information, which is all the security stuff stuffed in from the user domain. Now we carry that over to the resource domain. The resource guy just adds stuff to it. Well, now we've got claims that are already in there. He's going to be able to look at those claims and say, oh, we've got the exact same claims, so go right ahead. And they'll be able to use those claims and and there's no uniqueness between Forest A or Forest B. So now we've got a couple of claim types. So now let's go to resource properties. And here you're going to see a whole bunch of resource properties. Now, these IDs are unique identifiers the same way that we had for the claim types. So when we come along here, and we want the display name, not only does the ID have to be the same, but the display name has to be the same. So if I come along in here and create a new resource property, this resource property is going to be, where are we at here? We'll say company. I want it to match the company type that we had before. And we'll go ahead. And it says that it requires a value, so we'll need to go ahead and just say Contoso. And now I click OK. And it comes back, it failed to create it because the display name matches something that's already out there. Now, you could turn around and say, okay, this company, which has an ID of company underscore MS, it's one of the built-in ones. You could delete that. There are, and I'll try to show this as well. This is there's a application out there called the classification toolkit, which helps you along with how to do some of the classifications. What are a lot of these default ones? It uses all of these things. So when it creates these rules on how to identify and classify data, it expects that company underscore MS is there. Now, you can tweak the XML file that creates these definitions to make them match yours, but keep in mind that when you turn around and delete these things, you may run into something that's looking for this in particular if you are starting to look at solutions on the internet. So we'll go in here and we'll just say, what is, let's just create new, we had department and company. Let me get one more claim type that is kind of unique. Let's see. Home, looking for like the state or something like that. State or province. So there is ST. The display name will be state. It'll be user. And we will go ahead and select the following values. We will say North Carolina. Or South Carolina. So the reason that I did this was to show when we create these resource properties, we have something called either a resource property or a reference resource property. And so a resource property is just your basic, I'm going to give it some abstract name, it doesn't matter, and here's the values. I can either specify potential values, or I can type in, or I can just let anything show up in there. Or I can create a reference resource property which says, find me a claim that is going to have the exact same values or choice of values that you list that I will for a classification. This kind of helps match things up when you're creating these conditional expressions. And then so now we've got company. I'm just going to enable these. Notice that some of these look kind of grayed out, and then the ones that I created down the bottom, that one's not grayed out. So company, we've got, I'm going to go ahead and just enable that. This is saying that it requires a suggested value, so we don't have a suggested value. So I'm going to need to go in here, add either Contoso for the sake of time, I'll just have one in there, and department. Now I can enable it. Department, same thing. So now we've got our classification types. Now we've got some claims in here, and we've got our resource properties. Resource properties are interchangeable with the term classification, a classification type. So now let's go back into good old AD users and computers. And let's create Randy. And we'll also create Scott. And I'm going to go into View, and I'm going to select Advanced Features so I can see the attribute editor. Now I have this nice tab here where I can go through and see all my attributes. I can go through and say, okay, let's see, we did company. So I will set the company to Contoso here. Now notice, we had set a list of values in which a claim could be specified. You'll see that that is recognized and adhered to when we build the condition, because we're going to have this GUI that's going to say, okay, create this company equals, and then select from a drop-down your choices. But it doesn't, however, take into account the manual addition of you can type whatever you want in here. So there's still some considerations that need to be made for this. In the attribute, in the dis. Oh yeah, you could do that as well. So it's just trying to remember which one of these tabs is in here. Yeah. So you go into organization. Let's apply the change and see that hey, it actually changed. Go to organization. Now we got Contoso. Oh, here's department 2. So department. Let's see. We had finance. You can have your manager there. I don't know, how team-oriented your companies are, but you can base decisions off of your manager is Joe User. And so therefore, let's create a claim based on everybody's manager, and that way you can set permissions for particular teams. And if the manager changes, then you got some issues, but you may find some logic behind that. So there's a couple. So now, let me go back to actually, before we do that, I was just going to see it fail, but I don't think I have time. I'm going to go ahead and configure some group policy settings that are requirements to make this thing work. Group policy. And basically what we're doing is we're telling the environment that we now support claims. And there's a couple in here that we're going to have to set. So I'm just going to here, yep. Linked. Create a new GPO and link it here. We'll call this DAC support. And so for starters in here, if you go to Administrative Templates and Windows Components, Might be under system. We got our KDC. We want our KDC to support claims and armoring. And armoring is that feature that we talked about where we can piggyback on top of a domain control or on top of your workstation's authentication to more securely go through and perform our user authentication. And we can either say whether or not we want to always provide claims or fail otherwise. You got several choices in here. We'll just go with that for right now. And then we can go through to the Kerberos. The KDC is more for the KDC service. That needs to be applied to the domain controllers. It doesn't hurt to apply it to other things. Other things just don't have the KDC service, so it's just saying ignore the settings. Kerberos is where your client-side stuff is. So we basically got the same thing here. We got our Kerberos support, and we will enable this as well as compound authentication. So what happens with a couple of these things? You know, we talked about supported encryption types. So one, the settings that we made with setting the KDC to support this, as well as the client to support this stuff, it adds a bit field to the supported encryption types. I don't know how, if any of you have run into problems with AES encryption versus RC4 or, I'm sorry, what was the? Yeah, I'm thinking of one other. It'll come to me. I'm stage fright, I guess. But DES encryption. So, you know, along your Windows, your Apache servers and things like that with really old algorithms, in order to support that kind of stuff, you had to enable DES encryption. It's disabled by default. And so anyway, you play around with what encryption methods are supported by the Kerberos security provider through that attribute. So we just kind of use that number because it's a great place because it gets passed around all over the place to say, here's another bit flag to say we support this stuff. Compound identity is another one. This is actually going to be on the resource property to say, hey, I support device claims. I know what to do with them. So if it looks at the resource and sees this value set, it will then pass device claims. And that looks like it. The others, there's a couple more. Basically, you know, you can require it and make it fail, make things break if it doesn't work. But in general, those are your settings. We talked about your Server 2012 file server and how it could potentially support XP clients and Win 7 clients. There is a security setting in here under security options about allow S4U. There we go. This allows for a Server 2012 file server to go get the claim on behalf of the computer making or the user making the request. We're not going to worry about that. But there's our group policy. So we come in here on our workstation. Now that we have that policy, and I'm just going to log on as administrator. And let's go to I was going to go ahead and in computer management. By the way, I don't know, how many of you guys out there use Windows 8? Anyway, okay, great. Yeah, so right-clicking on this little charm that comes up is your friend. And 8.1 puts the little start window icon back. It's not necessarily your start menu, but now you got that thing down there permanently. Right-click on it, and this pretty much is a whole lot of the stuff that you're used to seeing inside your start menu. Here's my admin command prompt. I'm going to do a GP update force. So it gets those policies. And just in case I need it, I'm going to go ahead and that's a local Randy. Randy. And can I add two? Scott. All right. I'm just going to go ahead and log off and log on. I probably could do a run as, open that thing up, but let's try it this way. Password, let me make sure I get Fabricam. So now I'm logging on. Oh, it's going to go through the little wizard introducing me while it's doing that. So let's see what we can do in the back on the DC. So we've got these things in place. We've got our, so another thing that you can do, let's go back to our group policy here. Go into the, this goes domain-wide, so why not? I'm just going to go back and edit this thing as well. How many of you guys are familiar with security settings and advanced audit policy? Everybody? So we've got a little better way to streamline and cater to particular things that you want to turn on, when before you had to say, okay, object access on or off. Now you can kind of tune in on exactly what you want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and add a few here. Let's see. So account log on. Another just great piece of advice as you're talking about authentication and authorization. There are two different audit policy groups, one called account log on and one called log on. A lot of people get this confused. If you can imagine you wanting to go talk to a file server. You're on your workstation, want to go talk to a file server. That is going to consist of you knocking on the door of the file server saying, I'd like this resource, please. That transaction that occurs is a logon event. So a logon is you trying to gain access to something based off of credentials that you have in hand and introducing yourself to a resource. An account logon is a trusted authority that we talked about that is actually validating credentials. The authentication process involves validating a shared secret between two things, one of which is the password in your head. The other is a password attribute that's stored in Active Directory. It's that comparison and evaluation of that's the same thing that invokes an account logon. So when you go into account logon, you see stuff like Kerberos authentication. Okay, so let's go ahead and service Kerberos ticket requests. Sure, that looks good. Let's do that. We might find credential validation. This would be more NTLM type scenario. Kerberos authentication service, AS request versus TGS request. That's probably an MCSE question there. That's things that occur on the domain controller. If you're logging on locally, it occurs on the local machine based on the SAM database. Log on, we want to see that. Well, let's see. This is pretty cool. User and device claims. I can go through and configure it to show, let's see claims that goes through based on users and device. We'll go ahead and audit log on events. Now back to our user account. Now we got this guy here. We updated group policy. I don't think it requires any kind of a reboot, but we'll see. Let's go to the command prompt. So now nothing really looks different, but I can do this. Klist tickets. If you take a look, that's a tool that is going to display all the cached tickets in this user session. You'll see right here, actually we've got some new flags in here. It makes things much more descriptive. If you haven't looked at this stuff, you can see what KDC, which domain controller authenticated you. You can see whether it's a delegation or not. But what we're looking for is something that would indicate fast authentication. And I don't see that. So let me go ahead and reboot. It could be that. It could be, it was updated, so it should have gotten that. I'm going to restart. And I'm going to go back to my domain controller here and take a look at, audit log on, device claims. Those look pretty interesting. All right, so that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and do that as well. I am also going to look at object access and look at the file system as well, just because this is going to show us something that is quickly impactful for you when you set up just even some of these components. So there we go. There's all those group policies. Let's go back to our file server. So the one thing that I did do in preparation to this is I added the File Server Resource Manager role. So when this thing pops up, go to Add and Role Features. I was wanting to wait and finish this stuff. I'm impatient. It's a little tricky to find. It's under File Services. But that is the one role that I did go ahead and add to this guy. So this makes it a little slightly different than your standard server that you bring up. And this is what it does. So now I can go in here. I'm going to create a folder. Data share. And we'll call this important info. And let's go back to data share and let's share this thing out. We'll go ahead and just say authenticated users and grant this guy read and write. So now I go in here and go to Properties, and I've got a Classification tab. The reason that I have this is because I went ahead and installed the File Server Resource Manager role. It allows for the utilization of the classification attributes. If you go to Add Roles and Features, you can also do the there's a feature in here too, like Windows. It's under File and Storage. It's under here. There's File Server, but then there's also File Server Resource Manager. So it's a little tricky to find. If you don't install that and you want to see the classification tab, there is the Windows XPS Viewer. Desktop Experience. Install that, you'll get the same thing. And that's why, if me doing this from my Windows 8 client, I'm going to see the classification tab just from Windows 8 client because it has that stuff installed by default. So let's open up the File Resource Manager. Now keep in mind, this was around for 2008 R2. It just didn't have a whole lot of the added features and bonuses. You go into the classification management, you go into classification properties, and lo and behold, I just got 3 in there. None of the stuff that I put in Active Directory has made its way down here. There's a scheduled task that comes along that will update that. But we can run as administrator and say, let's see here, import module, File Server Resource Manager, and let's see, what's it called? Get help asterisk FSRM. So those of you who are not familiar with PowerShell, this is some very basic. Modules are a series of commandlets that you can import into your Windows PowerShell environment to grant you these great tools that you can use. So here are ones that have, I just did a get help and it includes wildcards, so now I can see all the ones that are FSRM. The one I'm looking for is update dash FSRM classification properties, and maybe sorry, what was that? Property. Update FSRM classification. Ah, yeah, thank you very much. Those guys that said press tab, I always forget that. You press tab and it auto-completes for you. So now, voila, it added company, department, state. So now I got the stuff that I can play with to run classification rules on. Now, I'm just going to go through, configure a classification rule. And, this will be test. I don't know the exact syntax. I think it's like a number sign, but here you can set the scope in which, okay, I want to add this to this particular folder. If we have time, I'll go back and play with this, but I know I'm not going to get this right the first time, so I'm just going to go through and kind of show you, okay, I wanted it to be on this data share folder. And the classification rule, you've got your content to search for search strings, things like that. folder based on its location or the Windows PowerShell. So I want to classify the company property, and I want to make it Contoso if it sees, see if there's any kind of example here, but let's just say, I know this is not going to work, but it's like number, dash, number, dash, number. You can go online, you can see all that stuff as to how it's going to do that. So if I have data not only in the name but in the content, and it can do both string and binary in these evaluations. But you put in these evaluations, and then I can go through and I can, and I need to enable the rule. So rules enabled. Now I can go to classification. One of these is, so here's my schedule. I can run the schedule to say, okay, once a week I wanted to do it this. But there's this thing down at the bottom, allow continuous classification. Throw it in this log to report how these things go. Now every single time I create a file in that directory, if that match is found, it's going to immediately classify that file. Thursday. Here's where you can also set up management tasks like we talked about with the archival or RMS. You can point to an RMS server and say, okay, encrypt this data when it's identified and found. So now we got our file server with our classification set up. Now let's go back to our workstation and see if our hello screen is now done. And I can go, and I'm logging on as me. Go back to my command prompt here and klist tickets. See, now it says cache flags primary fast. This flexible authentication, something tunneling, is one of the requirements as to how it can securely package and consume and request these claims during the KDC ticket exchanges. So, anybody use who am I? Do who am I space / who am I with nothing, tells you who you are. Who am I groups, here's all the security groups that I'm a member of. This is pulling straight from the security token in which the command prompt process is running. I can do who am I claims. Here's my claims. Department, there's the claim ID, finance, company, Contoso. Go back over to my file server. And I can go to, let's see, I'm going to pretend that that rule ran. So just trust me, you can run these rules that are going to scan data and identify that. So instead, let me go back here and go to my important info, go classification, and I'm just going to say company equals Contoso. So now that folder is company equals Contoso. I could create a classification rule that says anything in here is also going to inherit company equals Contoso. But I don't think just by putting it in here, yeah, it does. Okay. So by putting something in a container in which is classified, it's automatically going to be classified as Contoso. Now here's something where if you were to move this outside of this share and say, move it back over to here, I don't know if it would keep the classification or not. Nope, still does. Thank you. Okay, let's try that. Copy, paste, up. Still kept it. So, I think it might be just from the processing, one time, that stuff, like it says, alternate data stream that stays with the file, so it behaves a little differently than what you would expect, such as a security descriptor. So, that stuff's in there, and we've got this guy here. Now, the next thing that I want to do, because this is a pretty neat feature, since we've set the security on this, you go to the advanced, and you're going to see that the advanced security settings looks a little different. I'm going to go into this permissions, and I'm going to add a permission on here. It's saying select a principal. I'm just going to use domain users. But if you wanted to restrict it to a specific security group, such as it also needs to be sales, and within sales, you need to make sure that the company name is Contoso instead of Fabricam, you can do a combination of that. But ultimately, it's saying, okay, find me a scope in which this principal is, domain users or authenticated users, if you wanted to make it broad. Applies to this, and now let's add a condition. And let's say that the user's company equals, and this, because we did not do a multiple list, Contoso, that's why I had to type it in. But if I add another condition, now I can either do an and or operator, just here through the GUI, as well as, let's change this to department equals, now I got a drop-down menu. I'm going to remove this one just because I think Contoso is all that I'm sure that we have in here. So, okay, sure, let's give them full control. And let's hit OK. And let's also go into auditing. Right now, if you go into auditing, nothing is currently being audited. But if I go in here and say authenticated users, you can add a conditional expression here as well. User company equals Contoso. And so now you can restrict the auditing to say we're not worried about the majority, but we are worried about contractors. So if A dash is in the name or something like that, then go ahead and let's pay attention and report on what these guys and audit what these guys are looking at. So let's apply this. Effective access. So this tab got a lot better. There's a lot of work done. I know that there used to be some issues with the ability to update and the effectiveness of the reporting on this. But here I can go through and select a user and say Randy, check names, and say view the effective permissions. So right now it's set to full control. So let's go back here and take a look why. The reason that it's doing that is we have share permissions that says everyone full control. So share is doing nothing to stop us. Then we go to NTFS. NTFS here is showing authenticated users get full control. So let's remove that. First we'll disable inheritance. So now everything's explicitly set. We'll go in here to authenticated users. Let's remove authenticated users. Administrators, full control. This guy's not a local or domain administrator on this guy. He is a domain user, and he is in the company that equals Contoso. So now I can go through here to effective permissions. I can select a user and say, Randy. Try this again. And everything is currently denied. And the reason being is there is some updating that needs to be done to include that claim type. So we know that that claim user is here. So I guess there is still some lag behind that. But there is a button down here that says include a user claim. So let's say company equals Contoso. What would happen if I were to just kind of add that? Ooh, now we have full control. So it didn't update right away, but you have the ability to play in there. And not only did we do that with the user claim, you could go through in here and say, what would happen if I added Randy to the domain admins group? You've got the same capability up here. So some pretty cool little features here within effective access. So now that we've done that, I can go to my client and see, let's see, it was fab file 1 / data share, important data, new text document. I was able to get in there. Well, so how do you know that that was really what happened? You know, would Scott have actually failed? Well, if I go back to fab 1, and let's hope, I don't know, that group policy probably didn't update now that I think about it. Let's go into this guy and let's look in the security log and see if it gave us something. Gave us something good. We should have some type of file access. There it recognized our policy change. We'll just start from the top. So here's our actual file access. And this is Randy coming in using Kerberos, but it doesn't give us any claim information, and it doesn't give any file access information. That's just some process stuff. What we should have had is a file access event based on the fact that we set that auditing. And that file access audit event, the cool part about that would have been that it would have shown in the audit event the claim, or the classification that was on the resource. So I don't know if you guys have played around with XPath filtering and things like that, but you can filter through and do a lot of that to really maximize your reporting of the security audit events. Another thing that we didn't get a chance to show you, but you can read up on, is this file classification toolkit. This puts in a whole bunch of default rules, claim rules, a lot of the processing rules that I was showing you with the number, and all that. That will auto-populate a lot of your default standard for a lot of your government agency security clearance requirements, things like that, and does a lot of that work for you in outlining the classifications, their attribute set, their potential values and rules in order to flag content to say, okay, this needs to go here and there. So I would definitely recommend looking up some information on the classification toolkit. And another thing that we didn't quite get to in FabDC is under this guy we had resource properties and claim types. But in here you can also include resource property lists. So your resource properties, when I created these things, and the reason they got pushed down to that file server resource manager was because they were in something called the global resource property. This is kind of a catch-all bucket of when you create these things, it's going to get thrown in here. But if I wanted to create a new one, I can create a resource property list and just give myself a subset of these classifications. Let's say you've got a group that is rogue and just likes to do its own thing. You can say, okay, group, I'll give you your own set of classifications and let you do it. So beyond that, you then have global access policies that you define in group policy and push that down, and it would automate the administration of setting the conditional expressions that we did in the security page. And so I see a lot of signals that we're really running out of time. So sorry I didn't get to complete to everything, but you know, it might even be worth if you guys talk to these guys, we could go into some more advanced topics on this, or ADFS, could be another one.